My name is Clara Bennington. For 20 years, I lived and breathed the quiet, dignified scent of old wood, lemon polish, and archival paper that filled the halls of Blackwood and Sons. My father was a cabinet maker, a man who believed that the soul of a thing was in its joinery, in the patient, invisible work that held it all together. He taught me that integrity wasn't a grand gesture, but 1,000 small, honest decisions made when no one was watching. That philosophy became the bedrock of my career. I was Blackwood's head of heritage compliance, a title that sounds rather grand but was, in essence, the work of a patient guardian. Blackwood and Sons wasn't just a construction firm, it was a Harborview institution. We specialized in restoring the city's historic buildings, the proud brick sentinels and stone-faced grande dames that lined the cobbled streets overlooking the harbor. My job was to be the bridge between the past and the future. I secured the arcane permits, sourced the historically accurate materials, and held the certifications that allowed our craftsmen to breathe life back into structures that had stood for centuries. Each building told a story, and I was its devoted editor, ensuring its grammar and syntax remained true. My work wasn't on a balance sheet. It was in the silent strength of a restored beam, the authentic tint of a window pane, the legal and ethical foundation that allowed beauty to endure. And then, one rain-slicked Tuesday in April, the future arrived in the form of a video call. His name was Kian Sharp. He materialized on the conference room screen, a perfectly curated image of modern ambition. His hair was a sharp, geometric sculpture. His smile was a bright, sterile line. The head of finance, a man I'd known since he was a nervous intern, introduced him as our new chief strategy officer, brought on to optimize our workflow for the new century. The phrase hung in the air like a chemical smell. "Great to be here, team," Kian said, his voice smooth and frictionless. "I'm excited to help Blackwood shed some of its legacy weight and pivot towards a more agile, scalable future." His gaze swept across the faces in the room, pausing for a microsecond on mine. It was a look I recognized, not of malice, but of simple, categorical dismissal. It was the look of a man who sees a forest and only thinks of lumber. I felt a familiar, quiet ache settle in my chest, the same feeling I'd get when I saw a beautiful old building thoughtlessly demolished for a parking lot. I didn't react. I simply opened a new folder on my personal drive, a place I kept my garden plans and poetry notes. I named it Father's Workshop Blueprints and began methodically saving copies of every single certification, every guild charter, every municipal bond, and every federal heritage waiver that bore my name and my personal registration number. It wasn't an act of aggression. It was the simple, ingrained habit of a craftsman checking her tools before a storm. My father had always said, "Know the worth of your work, Clara, even if no one else does." At that moment, I felt a pressing need to take an inventory. Later that week, I overheard him in the hallway, talking to a pair of new project managers. "The whole artisanal angle is a bottleneck," he was saying, his hands gesturing as if sculpting air. "We need to systematize our sourcing, find synthetics that offer the same aesthetic with a 90% cost reduction. History is a brand, not a blueprint." One of the young men nodded eagerly. "Disrupt the historical space." "I love it." I slipped into the archives, the cool, quiet room where the original plans for half the city were stored in long cardboard tubes. The air smelled of time itself. I ran my hand over a blueprint from 1888, the paper as delicate as a dried leaf. Disruption, I thought, was a word for things that were broken. Preservation was the work of keeping things whole. Kian's first official act was a company-wide vision sync. He stood before us in the main boardroom, the old oak-paneled walls seeming to shrink away from his stark white slide deck. The presentation was a blizzard of buzzwords: synergistic alignment, proactive desk stratification, future-forward momentum. I watched the younger staff members nod, their eyes bright with the promise of a revolution. They didn't understand that Blackwood wasn't a tech startup. It was a trust, handed down through generations. Then, A slide appeared with a new organizational chart. It was a sterile web of interconnected boxes. My department, Heritage Compliance, was gone. In its place was a small, free-floating box labeled Legacy Protocols. My name was under it. To streamline our processes, Kian announced, pointing a laser at my box, we'll be reevaluating roles that are centered on historical dependencies. We thank Clara for her years of foundational work, but we must look forward. Foundational work. He said it as if he were talking about the old plumbing in the basement, something to be ripped out and replaced. A quiet sadness bloomed in me, but it was etched with a strange, cool clarity. He didn't see the foundation. He saw an obstacle. That evening, I stayed late. The office was hushed, the only sound the gentle hum of the servers. I logged into the 3 separate national and state heritage boards where I was the registered agent for Blackwood. My credentials, my photograph, my digital signature, they were the keys to every gate. I printed a copy of my employment contract, the one I'd signed 2 decades ago. I focused on a single, unassuming clause my lawyer had insisted on, Article 12b, professional stewardship. It stated that all professional certifications and licenses held in my name and paid for by the company were extensions of my personal liability and professional standing. In the event of my involuntary termination, they would not be transferable. They would be nullified. It wasn't a trap. It was a statement of fact. My expertise, my reputation, was my own. It was not an asset that could be sold or reassigned like a desk chair. As I left the building, the night air was cold and clean against my face. I looked up at the Blackwood and Sons sign, its gold leaf gleaming under the streetlights. A deep, seismic shift had begun, and I knew, with the certainty of a mariner reading the sky, that the ground beneath us was no longer stable. The dismantling of my world was done not with a bang, but with a series of quiet, polite clicks of a mouse. By the following Wednesday, my access to the central project database was revoked. A pop-up window informed me, "Your permissions have been updated. Please contact your administrator for access." For 20 years, I was the administrator. I sent a calm, factual email to the IT department. The automated reply informed me that all administrative requests must now be routed through the Chief Strategy Officer. I was being locked out of the house I had helped build, one room at a time. Kian's strategy was insidious. He never confronted me directly. Instead, he made me irrelevant. My primary responsibility, the meticulous preparation for the biannual state heritage audit, was reassigned to a young marketing associate named Caden who, during a brief handover meeting, asked if Tudor Style was a brand we could trademark. I was given the task of digitizing 2 decades of archived expense reports, a project so mind-numbingly tedious it was clearly meant to be a quiet, soul-crushing exile. I would sit at my desk, the rhythmic click of my keyboard a stark contrast to the urgent, complex work I used to do. I could feel the sympathetic, pitying glances from my colleagues. Maria, a kind woman in accounting who had been with the firm almost as long as I had, would leave cups of herbal tea on my desk, her eyes full of a sadness she couldn't voice. "It's not right, Clara," she whispered one afternoon, hovering by my cubicle. "He's running this place like a software company. He doesn't understand that the reason clients trust us is because of the old ways. Because of you." "He has a different vision, Maria," I replied, my voice even. "All we can do is the work that's put in front of us." But the work in front of me was meaningless. My real work, the stewardship of Blackwood's integrity, was being systematically dismantled. The final indignity came in the form of a mandatory role evolution interview. We were all required to reapply for our own jobs, to pitch our value to Kian as if we were new candidates. The younger employees came out of his office buzzing, talking about the dynamic new opportunities and the culture of innovation he was building. When it was my turn, I walked into his glass-walled office and sat down. The space was minimalist and cold, decorated with abstract art that looked like error messages. I hadn't brought a portfolio or a resume. My work was in the very walls of the city around us. Kian didn't look up from his laptop for a full minute. Clara, he said finally, as if recalling a distant fact. You have a lot of institutional knowledge. That's valuable. He said the word valuable with the same inflection he might use for obsolete. He turned his screen towards me. It showed a flowchart filled with circles and arrows, connecting various departments to a central hub labeled Sharp Strategy Core. He pointed to my old department. We're absorbing the legacy protocol's function into marketing and ops, he explained. We need to be able to leverage our history as a selling point, not be constrained by it. He clicked to another file, a project plan for the restoration of the old customs house, our most prestigious project. I saw a note in the margin, source alternative for Vermont slate. Explore synthetic options. Check with Caden on aesthetic match. A cold dread, sharp and clear, pierced through my calm. The Vermont slate was not an aesthetic choice. It was a structural and historical requirement mandated by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Using a synthetic substitute would not only be a betrayal of the building's integrity, it would be a direct violation of the Preservation Charter, the very charter I was the sole signatory on. Kian, I said, my voice quiet but firm. The Vermont slate is a non-negotiable term of the federal grant that's funding half of that project. Using a synthetic would void the agreement and require us to pay back the full amount. He blinked, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. We can renegotiate the terms. We just need to be agile. There is no renegotiation on a federal charter, I stated. It is a binding covenant. He gave a small, condescending smile. Thank you for the historical context, Clara. We'll take it under advisement. I walked out of his office and back to my desk, the air feeling thin and sharp in my lungs. He hadn't heard a word. He had heard an obstacle. That afternoon, I went online and scheduled an appointment with a public notary for the following morning. I took a blank copy of the official Declaration of Professional Relinquishment form from the National Trust's website. I didn't fill it out. I just wanted to have it, a quiet, final tool in my possession. Not a weapon, but an anchor, a way to hold fast to my own professional soul, even if the ship I was on was sailing determinately into a storm. I was no longer trying to save Blackwood and Sons from Kian. I was trying to save the last, most important thing I had, my own integrity. The end came on a Monday. There is a particular cruelty to Mondays, a stark, unflinching light that exposes all the things we've been trying to ignore. Kian had called an all-hands meeting in the main atrium, a space designed to feel grand and welcoming, with its soaring ceiling and a beautiful, restored mosaic floor I had personally overseen the restoration of years ago. We stood in a loose, uncomfortable circle while Kian paced before us, radiating an energy that was both manic and triumphant. Team, he began, his voice echoing slightly in the large space. As part of our forward momentum strategy, we've made some tough but necessary decisions to streamline our operational core. He used the word streamline like a shield. We're moving away from legacy-dependent roles and embracing a more decentralized, agile approach to our work. I stood perfectly still, my hands clasped loosely in front of me. I felt a strange sense of calm, the peace that comes when you know an inevitable conclusion has finally arrived. He stopped pacing and his eyes found mine across the room. There was no emotion in them, only the flat, impersonal finality of a business decision. To that end, he announced to the silent crowd, effective immediately, Clara Bennington's position as head of Heritage Compliance has been made redundant. A collective, silent intake of breath seemed to ripple through the room. A few people glanced at me with wide, shocked eyes. Others stared intently at the mosaic floor, as if tracing its intricate patterns could transport them somewhere else. Two figures from Human Resources, both young and looking deeply uncomfortable, detached themselves from the edge of the circle and approached me. One of them held out a slim, beige folder. "Clara," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "if you'll just come with us." I took the folder. Inside was a termination letter, full of cold, legalistic language about restructuring and efficiency. There was no mention of severance, only a final paycheck and a page for my signature. I pulled a fountain pen from my bag, a gift from my father years ago, and signed my name on the line with a steady, fluid stroke. "I'll need a printed copy of the fully executed document for my records," I said, my voice clear and even. Kian, who had been watching from a distance, frowned. "It's all cloud-based now. We'll email you the PDF." "I require a physical copy," I repeated, not raising my voice, but imbuing it with a weight that brooked no argument. A few minutes later, I walked out of the Blackwood & Sons building for the last time. In my bag, I had my personal effects, 20 years of my life packed into a single cardboard box. And in my hand, I held a single, stapled piece of paper, warm from the printer. It was a receipt for my own professional freedom. As I signed that document, the quiet, unassuming Article 12B of my contract was triggered. It was not a thunderclap, but a silent, logical sequence of events set into motion across the digital ether. At precisely 5:01 p.m., as the company's servers ran their end-of-day protocols, automated notifications were dispatched from my personal accounts to the state and national heritage boards. The subject line was simple: voluntary relinquishment of professional stewardship, reg #734B. By the time I was home, sitting in my quiet living room with a cup of chamomile tea, the first confirmation emails began to arrive. "Your signatory authority for the Harborview Historical Preservation Society has been formally rescinded. Your credentials with the National Trust Guild have been marked inactive. Your status as a registered heritage agent for Blackwood & Sons has been nullified." I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel a surge of vengeful triumph. I felt a profound, aching sadness for the beautiful, venerable institution I had loved and served, an institution that had chosen to amputate its own memory. I went to bed early that night, and, for the first time in months, I slept soundly, a deep, dreamless sleep, like a ship that has finally reached a calm and sheltered harbor after a long and treacherous voyage. The storm was no longer mine to weather. The first tremor hit on Wednesday morning. It began, as most disasters do, with a small, seemingly insignificant problem. Blackwood's primary supplier of period-accurate masonry and custom-milled hardwoods tried to process a standing order for the old Customs House restoration. Their system returned an error. Receiving entity's Heritage Guild certification is invalid. Shipment cannot be authorized. By 10 a.m., the tremors were becoming quakes. The internal compliance dashboard I had designed, a system I'd built to be a clear, intuitive guardian of our responsibilities, began to light up. One by one, the green lights indicating active compliance flickered and turned to a stark, warning red. Permits were flagged as pending recertification. Active project charters were tagged with signatory authority orphaned. The entire digital framework that guaranteed Blackwood's legitimacy was bleeding out in real time. Maria called me around noon, her voice a strained, panicked whisper. "Clara, what is happening? No one can get anything approved. The city planning office just put a stop work order on the waterfront project. They said our permits are void." "I'm no longer with the company, Maria," I said gently. "I can't speak to their internal processes. But this all has to do with your old certifications. Kian is running around telling everyone to just resubmit the paperwork. Caden tried to log into the National Trust portal using your old credentials, and it locked him out. Now the whole system is frozen." She paused, and I could hear the dawning realization in her voice. "He didn't know, did he? He didn't understand that it was all tied to you." "My work was a personal, professional responsibility, Maria," I explained. "It was never just a company asset." "He called the Heritage Board," she continued, her voice dropping lower. "They told him that re-registering a new agent requires a full vetting process. It could take 3 to 6 months. Months, Clara. The Customs House project will be dead by then." I imagine Kian, with his slicked-back hair and his unwavering belief in the power of disruption, being told that he had to wait. that he had to follow a slow, meticulous process rooted in trust and history. I imagined him trying to use buzzwords on a civil servant who had likely been processing the same forms for 30 years. The true chaos, I learned later, was internal. Kian, in a desperate attempt to regain control, tried to manually override the compliance dashboard. He saw it as a malfunctioning piece of software, not as an impartial messenger. But I had built it with integrity. Any attempt to tamper with the data logs would create an immutable audit trail and send an automatic alert to the firm's legal counsel and, as a legacy redundancy I had never removed, to the personal inbox of the CEO, Donovan Croft. By lunchtime, Kian was no longer the visionary leader. He was a man in a cage of his own making, rattling the bars while the walls slowly closed in. And I, for my part, was sitting on a bench by the Harborview Harbor, watching the gulls wheel and cry against a vast, open sky. I ate a simple lunch of bread and cheese I'd packed from home. The air tasted of salt and freedom. The sounds of the city, the distant clang of a buoy, the rumble of a ferry, were a soothing balm. The world of Blackwood, with its artificial urgency and its hollow new philosophy, felt a million miles away. It was their storm now. My work was done. On Friday morning, the state heritage auditors arrived for their scheduled biannual inspection. It wasn't a surprise visit. I had scheduled it myself 6 months prior, as I always did. It was a fixed point in the calendar, as reliable as the solstice. They were met at the reception desk by a flustered assistant who had no idea who they were. The auditors, 2 stern-faced individuals with an air of implacable authority, asked to speak with the firm's registered compliance officer. When told there wasn't one, they simply opened their briefcases and produced a stop work order for every active Blackwood project within the state's jurisdiction. They were polite, professional, and utterly unmovable. The news of the failed audit spread through the company like a virus. It was no longer a matter of delayed shipments or frozen permits. This was a public declaration of failure, a stain on the Blackwood name that had stood, immaculate, for over a century. Clients began calling, their voices tight with anxiety. Contracts, I knew, contained clauses that were triggered by a failure to maintain continuous compliance. The financial bleeding was about to begin. Maria called me again that evening, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "Donovan Croft flew in this morning," she said. "He cut his vacation short. He's been locked in the boardroom with Kian and the legal team all day. We can hear him shouting from down the hall." Donovan Croft, the grandson of the original founder. A man who had inherited a legacy and, in his detached country club way, had allowed it to be entrusted to a charlatan. He was a man of tradition, but he had been seduced by the siren song of modernity, of profit margins and scalable solutions. "He knows, Clara," Maria said. "They finally pulled up your original contract." They read Article 12b. Someone from legal had to explain to him what professional nullification meant. He just sat there, they said, staring at the wall. She paused. "They're going to try to get you back. They're drafting an offer." I thanked her for the warning and hung up. I felt a flicker of something, not anger, but a deep, weary sadness. Did they truly believe it was something that could be fixed with money? That my signature, my professional soul, was a commodity to be bought back once its value was finally understood. I went into my small study, a room lined with books on architecture, history, and botany. I looked at the framed photograph on my desk, a picture of my father in his workshop, his hands covered in sawdust, a gentle, knowing smile on his face. "Know the worth of your work, Clara." The next morning, an email arrived. The sender was Donovan Croft himself. The subject line read, "An urgent and sincere proposal." The message was a masterpiece of corporate contrition. It spoke of unfortunate oversights, of a strategic misstep, and of the deep and abiding respect the company had for my unparalleled expertise. It offered me a newly created role, executive consultant for heritage integrity, at a salary that was double my old one. It promised autonomy, respect, and a key voice in the company's future. It was a king's ransom, offered to a commoner they had cast out into the street only days before. I sat with the email for a long time, reading and rereading the carefully chosen words. They were asking me to come back and repair the damage, to restore the foundations they had so carelessly shattered. They were asking me to lend them my name, my integrity, to make them whole again. I thought of my father's workshop, of the quiet dignity of a well-made thing. I thought of the 20 years I had poured my heart into Blackwood and Sons, not for the salary, but for the love of the work itself. I had been its guardian, and they had mistaken my quiet service for obsolescence. They hadn't just fired an employee, they had betrayed a trust. With a steady hand, I began to type my reply. Subject: an urgent and sincere proposal. Dear Mr. Croft, thank you for your generous offer. I have given it careful consideration. For 20 years, I had the privilege of serving as the guardian of Blackwood's legacy. That legacy, I have come to understand, is not something that can be bought or sold. It is a responsibility. My work was to ensure that the foundations were strong, the joinery was true, and the structure was sound, both physically and ethically. A foundation once broken cannot be patched with money. Trust, once shattered, cannot be rebuilt with a new job title. I dedicated my professional life to the principle of integrity, and I must, in the end, be true to it. Therefore, I must respectfully decline your offer. My professional certifications were a reflection of my personal commitment to my craft. I cannot, in good conscience, lend my name to an organization that has demonstrated it no longer shares that commitment. I wish you and the company all the best in navigating the challenges ahead. Sincerely, Clara Bennington. I pressed send. And as the email disappeared into the digital void, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying. It was the weight of a responsibility that was no longer mine to bear. I had not burned a bridge. I had simply chosen to stand on the shore I had reached, a shore built of my own self-respect. 3 months later, the first green shoots of a new life began to appear. I didn't join a large competitor. The world of corporate strategy and scalable solutions held no appeal for me. Instead, I opened a small consulting practice out of a sunlit room in my own home. I called it Bennington Heritage Stewardship. My clients weren't large firms, but small historical societies, independent artisans, and town councils who wanted to preserve their local landmarks with care and authenticity. The work was smaller in scale, but its meaning felt immense. News of Blackwood and Sons would reach me occasionally, like driftwood washing ashore. Kian Sharp was gone, dismissed in a quiet, unceremonious purge. The company had managed to hire a new compliance officer, but the damage was done. They had lost the old Customs House project and 2 of their other most prestigious clients, who cited a crisis of confidence in the firm's leadership. The Blackwood name, once a synonym for trust, was now tarnished with the memory of their spectacular, self-inflicted failure. One crisp autumn afternoon, I was walking through the old city market, buying apples from a local farmer. I saw Donovan Croft across the square. He looked older, his shoulders stooped, the confident swagger gone. He was no longer the detached, suntanned CEO, but a man burdened by the weight of a diminished legacy. Our eyes met for a brief moment across the bustling crowd. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was not an apology, but it was, I think, a gesture of recognition. I returned the nod, a silent acknowledgement of the painful lesson that had been learned. Later that day, back in my quiet office, I pinned a small, hand-calligraphed quote to the corkboard above my desk. It was something my father used to say as he ran his hand over a finished piece of furniture, checking for flaws. "The strength is in the part you cannot see." He was talking about dovetail joints and mortise and tenons, about the invisible work that creates enduring beauty. But as I looked at the words, I understood them in a new way. He was also talking about integrity, about self-worth, about the quiet, unseen foundation of a life well lived. My name was no longer on Blackwood's letterhead, and the licenses no longer bore my signature. But I had learned that my true worth was not a credential to be granted or revoked by others. It was the foundation I had built within myself, a structure that no one could ever dismantle. And it was strong.